right, hey nerds. So, I'm going to continue my series about John Locke's famous essay, Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. So, first, I'll just review what empiricism is. It's a philosophical theory that asserts knowledge is primarily or solely derived from sensory experience and empirical evidence. Basically, we gain all of our knowledge through our senses. And it points that our understanding of the world and our knowledge are built upon what we experience through our senses: sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell, and the observations that we make. So John Locke's empiricism, specifically, he argued that the mind is a blank slate at birth, as many people have heard the terms of blank slate, and knowledge is acquired through sensory experience. Of course, there's that famous Steven Pinker book, The Blank Slate, in which he's criticizing that idea, although he's kind of criticizing the idea in sociology, not really philosophy. But anyway, so empiricism emphasizes sensory experience and observation as the primary sources of knowledge. So let's review John Locke here. So he's a British 17th century Enlightenment philosopher, and he hated academic pageantry, which I like about him. So he got interested in politics, science, and religion, as many Enlightenment philosophers often did, of course. And then he wrote the famous essay that I'm talking about, Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, in which he lays out his theory for empiricism. And he basically talks about how this idea that he calls understanding allows us to perceive other things, but it doesn't notice itself. And that understanding is its own object. It's sort of an idea separate from human consciousness. And then let's go into the specific way he divides ideas here. So he has basically a division of the different types of simple ideas. There are some which come to our minds by one sense only. Secondly, there are ones that convey themselves into the mind by more senses than one. Thirdly, that are from reflection only. Fourthly, there's some that make themselves that way and are suggested to the mind by all the ways of sensation and reflection. Okay, so that's just a little more context for what we're talking about here. Oh, I lost my spot. That's okay. It's right here. Okay. So he's talking about the way that his theory of ideas work in his essay Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, and he's basically talking about the idea of, oh, here it is. He's talking about perception, and that this basically equates to thinking. And he has some interesting thoughts, but he has some obvious flaws in his logic here too. Okay, so perception is the first simple idea of reflection. So we perceive ideas through our reflection. Perception, as it is the first faculty of the mind exercised about our ideas, so it is the first and simplest idea we have from reflection. It is by some called thinking. So thinking is perceiving. Basically, remember, we gain knowledge through our senses. So we perceive the world, reflect on our perceptions, and that's thinking to him, which is not really exactly correct, because we, like I was saying before, we don't actually gain all of our knowledge through our sense experience. And I don't need to get into my criticisms of that. You can see my my video. I think I called Locke does not understand understanding. But anyway, so there's the first flaw there. But then he continues, reflection alone can give us the idea of what perception is. So I don't think that's actually true, but perhaps it's true, because you gain knowledge from sense experience, and you gain it from actually learning things. And reflection is not sense experience. But anyway, so reflection alone can give us the idea of what perception is. What perception is, everyone will know better by reflecting on what he does himself when he sees, hears, feels, etc., or thinks, than by any discourse of mine. So, of course, he's going back to the empiricism. We learn more through our senses than through any discourse. Of course, he's talking about reflection, of course, and it's obviously the case that many times we learn more about our reflections of our sense perceptions than we actually do from our sense perceptions, because if we don't reflect on our sense perceptions, then we can just trust them and they can deceive us. Or, you know, is it as simple as, like, I touch this burner and then my instincts tell me to pull my hand away before it gets burned, if we're assuming the burner is on, of course. Is that giving me knowledge? I mean, I think I already if that's knowledge, it's just instinct, so it happens automatically and you don't need to think about that. But it seems like to Locke, instincts are thought, which obviously is not true, because they happen subconsciously rather than consciously. All right, so he continues. Or basically, in this section, he's just talking about his opinion that hearing is a really powerful sense and gives us very accurate information, in his opinion. Okay, so he continues. Children may though this is interesting. Children, though they may have ideas in the womb, have none innate. So they have ideas in the womb, but then when they're born, they don't have ideas anymore. Like, do they have ideas or not? That doesn't make sense. That's one of the weirdest examples in here, and one of the best examples of him being terrible at thinking, and his theory of thinking having huge logical flaws in it. Okay, so he continues. Therefore, I doubt not but children, by the exercise of their senses about objects that affect them in the womb, receive some few ideas before they are born. So they receive ideas before they're born. They have ideas in the womb, but then they have no ideas when they are born. Like I said, that doesn't make any sense, man. um, as the unavoidable effects either of the bodies that environ them, or also those wants or diseases they suffer, amongst which, if one may conjecture concerning things not very capable of examination. Okay, so he continues. Which ideas appear first is not evident nor important, even though he just described what ideas appear first, and he's like, if he doesn't think they're important, then he shouldn't be mentioning them. So he's mentioning them because they seem to be important, and he's obviously, like I said, he's contradicting himself with his theory here. Okay, so he continues. Ideas of sensation are often changed by judgment. That's true. We're farther to consider concerning perception that the ideas we receive by sensation are often in grown people altered by the judgment without our taking notice of it. That's definitely true too. We reflect on our perceptions and then we change our judgments of our perceptions, sometimes without even noticing that we have changed our perceptions. That's like that definitely happens to us. We taste something, and then you don't taste it for a while, and then years later you taste it again and it seems to taste totally different to you, and you don't know why that happened. I think that's a really good example of what he's talking about there. All right, so he continues. This judgment is apt to be mistaken for direct perception, but this is not, I think, usual in any of our ideas but those perceived by sight. So this time he's talking about how sight is more important. And again, he's mentioning which ideas are first and more important, even though he said this is irrelevant. But this is not, I think, usual in any of our ideas, but those received by sight, because sight, the most comprehensive of all our senses, conveying to our minds the ideas of light and colors, which are peculiar only to that sense, and also the far different ideas of space, figure, and motion, the several varieties whereof change the appearance of its proper objects, visualization, light, and colors, we bring ourselves by use to judge of the one by the other. So basically, he's just saying that sight is the most strong sense, which even though earlier he said that hearing is the strongest sense, so he's contradicting himself in that sense, and he's also saying, like I said, the best example of him contradicting himself and showing that his theory of thinking is not, ironically, not very well thought out. That babies have ideas in the womb, but then they don't have ideas when they're born. Okay, so he continues. Uh, So, perception, the inlet of all materials of knowledge. Perception, then, being the first step and degree towards knowledge, and the inlet of all the materials of it, the fewer senses any man as well as any other creature hath, and the fewer and the duller uh, the impressions are that are made by them, and the duller the faculties are that are employed about them, the more remote are they from that knowledge which is to be found in some men. So it seems like he's basically saying there that if we if we have ideas that we haven't thought about for a while and they're farther from our perception, then we know less about them, which like to basically explain what he's saying in way more words than that, there that if we know of an idea but we haven't thought of it for a long time, then we don't know as much about it because it's farther from our knowledge. Makes sense, right? Like, and then some things you can remember well, but you're rusty at them at first until you remember them again because you still have the neural pathways, like riding a bike or driving a car. If you rode a bike when you were a kid and then you didn't for like a decade and then you ride again, you might be a little rusty and fall down at first, but you'll still know how to ride a bike. It'll be knowledge, but it'll be like in the back of your brain, so because you won't use it most of the time, right? And you could say the same thing about driving a car. If you drove a car and then bought a car and then lost your job and had to sell your car or something, and then you don't drive for a while and for years, and then you come back to driving, it feels weird at first, but then you get used to it, so that knowledge is farther from your mind because you don't know as much about it, right? So anyway, like I was saying, Locke's theory has some really good points, but I think there's some really crucial logical flaws, uh, namely being that he contradicts himself in terms of saying that what ideas come first after birth are not relevant, and what the most important ideas and senses are is not important, even though he goes on to explain which senses are important and which ideas happen first. And then also this weird example saying, in which he says that babies in the womb have ideas, but then they don't have ideas when they're born, which doesn't make any sense. So anyway, this is all the way that, in a nutshell, even though John Locke's theory makes some really good points, John Locke is ultimately terrible at thinking.